Captain Jake Morrison stood perfectly still on the bridge of the UES Horizon as he watched the holographic message display in front of him. The alien figure speaking was at least 9 feet tall with blue skin that seemed to shimmer under some kind of natural bioluminescence. Its name was Thexali, and it represented something called the Velcron Diplomatic Corps. Jake had watched this same message 17 times now, and each viewing made his stomach tighten with an uncomfortable mixture of excitement and suspicion. The message was simple enough on the surface. Humanity was being formally invited to join the Galactic Council after 200 years of deliberate isolation following first contact. Earth would finally have a seat at the table with the other civilized species of the galaxy. The Velcron diplomat spoke in flawless English about trade opportunities and cultural exchange and technological advancement. Everything humanity had dreamed about since those first alien ships appeared in orbit around Jupiter back in 2187. Lieutenant Emma Hayes sat at her tactical station with her fingers dancing across the holographic controls. She had served under Jake for 8 years now, and she knew him well enough to read the tension in his shoulders. Emma was brilliant with weapon systems and threat assessment, but her real gift was reading people. Right now she could tell that her captain was deeply troubled by something in that message. Jake finally spoke without taking his eyes off the hologram. His voice was quiet but firm. Every crew member on the bridge could hear the concern bleeding through his professional tone. He told Emma to run a complete analysis of the treaty documents that came with the invitation. He wanted every clause examined and every subsection translated and verified. He wanted to know what Earth was really agreeing to before anyone signed anything official. Emma nodded and immediately began pulling up the files. The treaty package was massive. Hundreds of pages of legal text written in what appeared to be a universal diplomatic language that had then been translated into English. The translation software seemed adequate, but Emma knew that subtle meanings could get lost between languages, especially when those languages evolved on completely different worlds with completely different cultural contexts. Back on Earth, the celebration had already begun. Admiral Kevin Parker commanded the United Earth Fleet from headquarters in Geneva, and he had received the same invitation 6 hours before the horizon. The news had spread across the planet within minutes. People were dancing in the streets of New York and London and Tokyo and Mumbai. Humanity was finally being accepted into the greater galactic community. The isolation was over. The waiting was done. Jake understood the excitement, but he could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. 200 years ago, when the aliens first made contact, they had been polite but distant. They had shared basic technology and established communication protocols, but they had made it very clear that humanity was not ready to join their council. Earth needed time to mature as a species. That was the exact phrase they had used. Mature as a species. So humanity had spent 2 centuries working to prove themselves worthy. They had eliminated most major conflicts on Earth. They had established colonies on Mars and Europa and Titan. They had built a respectable fleet of deep space vessels. They had developed their own technology instead of just copying alien designs. Everything humanity did was aimed at eventually earning that invitation to join the galactic community. And now the invitation had finally arrived. But the timing seemed strange to Jake. Nothing significant had changed in the past year. Humanity had not made any major breakthrough or solved any critical problem. They were essentially the same species they had been 12 months ago. So why was the Council suddenly ready to welcome them now? Dr. Lisa Chen worked in the Linguistics Research Station on Earth's orbital platform. She was the best xenolinguist humanity had ever produced, with a natural gift for understanding alien communication patterns. When the treaty documents arrived, she immediately began a deep analysis of the Velcron language structures. Lisa had spent 15 years studying every scrap of alien communication that Earth had collected. She knew how the Velcron thought and how they structured their legal documents. What she found in the treaty made her blood run cold. The document was written in a deliberately confusing style that used multiple layers of dependent clauses and conditional statements. Most of it was straightforward enough. Trade agreements and technology sharing and diplomatic protocols. But buried deep in Section 47 was a paragraph that used very specific Velcron legal terminology. The English translation called it a voluntary resource contribution during crisis events. That sounded reasonable enough. Of course, member species would help each other during emergencies. But Lisa knew that the Velcron word being translated as voluntary did not actually mean optional. It meant assigned or designated. And the phrase crisis events in Velcron legal language specifically referred to military conflicts. Lisa immediately tried to contact Admiral Parker, but she was told he was in a meeting with the president and could not be disturbed. She sent an urgent message flagged with the highest priority. She explained that the treaty contained a mandatory military conscription clause that had been deliberately mistranslated to appear optional. She begged them to halt the signing ceremony until the translation could be properly verified. Her message arrived 7 minutes too late. The signing ceremony had already taken place in Geneva with full media coverage. The President of Earth had placed her signature on the treaty alongside the holographic representatives of the Galactic Council. Champagne was being poured. Speeches were being made. Humanity was officially a member of the galactic community. Lisa sat at her desk with her head in her hands. She had failed. The warning had come too late. Now Earth was bound by a treaty that required them to contribute military forces whenever the Council demanded it. And based on her analysis of Velcron diplomatic history, she knew exactly what that meant. 48 hours after the signing ceremony, the first official order arrived through Council communication channels. Commander Ben Wright opened the message in the Situation Room at Earth Fleet Headquarters. He was surrounded by Admiral Parker and a dozen other senior military officers. They had expected some kind of initial assignment, maybe a joint training exercise or a goodwill tour of Council space. What they got instead made everyone in the room go silent. The message was brief and formal. All human naval vessels were hereby ordered to deploy to something called the Queller Sector for peacekeeping operations. The deployment timeline was 72 hours. No exceptions, no delays. Every ship in the Earth fleet was being sent to a region of space that none of them had ever heard of before. Admiral Parker immediately pulled up star charts. Lieutenant Amy Foster was the best navigator in the fleet, and she quickly located the Queller Sector. Her face went pale as she read the tactical reports. The Queller Sector was deep in contested space, roughly 3 months travel time from Earth at maximum speed. It sat at the intersection of 3 hostile alien empires that had been fighting each other for longer than humanity had been spacefaring. Amy's voice shook slightly as she read the casualty statistics. The Galactic Council had been trying to maintain peace in the Queller Sector for 50 years. In that time, they had lost thousands of ships. The casualty rate for peacekeeping forces assigned to that region exceeded 70%. It was a meat grinder, a place where ships and crews went to die. The truth crashed down on everyone in that room at the same moment. The Council had not invited humanity to join them out of respect or friendship. They needed fresh bodies for a war they were losing. They needed cannon fodder, and they had deliberately hidden that fact in a mistranslated treaty that Earth had already signed. Admiral Parker's jaw tightened as he stared at the deployment orders. His hands gripped the edge of the table hard enough to make his knuckles white. Around him, the other officers were beginning to react with anger and disbelief. Someone cursed. Someone else demanded they refuse the order. The room was filling with outraged voices. Jake Morrison had just received the same orders on the horizon. He read them twice to make sure he understood correctly. Then he called his senior staff to the briefing room. Emma arrived first, followed by the chief engineer and the navigation officer. They all saw the expression on their captain's face and knew something terrible had happened. Jake explained the situation in simple terms. Earth had been tricked into signing a military conscription treaty. The Council was sending their entire fleet into a combat zone with a 70% casualty rate. They had 72 hours to comply or face economic sanctions and military blockade. The Council enforcement fleet was already moving into position near the solar system. Emma felt rage building in her chest. Humanity had worked for 200 years to earn a place in the galactic community. They had done everything asked of them, and this was their reward: to be used as disposable soldiers in someone else's war, to be sacrificed because the Council species were too comfortable or too cowardly to fight their own battles. The chief engineer asked the question everyone was thinking. What were they going to do? They were bound by treaty. If they refused the order, Earth would be isolated completely, cut off from all galactic trade and technology, blockaded in their own solar system. But if they obeyed the order, most of them would die in a pointless war that had nothing to do with humanity. Jake looked at each of his officers in turn. His expression was calm, but his eyes were hard. He told them they were going to comply with the order. They were going to take the Earth fleet to the Queller sector exactly as commanded. Everyone stared at him in shock. Emma started to protest, but Jake held up his hand. He was not finished speaking. They were going to comply with the letter of the order, but not the spirit. The council expected them to arrive and die like obedient cannon fodder. That was not going to happen. Jake's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. They were going to the Queller sector, but they were not going there to die. They were going there to win. The 72-hour countdown began the moment the council's deployment order arrived. Admiral Kevin Parker sat in his office at Earth Fleet Headquarters, staring at the star charts displayed across his desk. The Queller sector glowed red on the map, indicating active combat zones. Intelligence reports scrolled past, showing ship losses and casualty figures that made his stomach turn. 50 years of continuous fighting, and the Council had made almost no progress toward ending the conflict. Commander Ben Wright entered the office carrying a data tablet loaded with personnel files. He had been working for 6 hours straight, pulling together deployment rosters and ship assignments. His face was drawn with exhaustion and something darker. Ben had lost his brother in a training accident 3 years ago, and the thought of sending thousands more people to their deaths was eating him alive. Kevin asked for the numbers, and Ben delivered them without emotion. Earth could deploy 300 ships to the Queller sector within the 72-hour window. That represented almost the entire combat-ready fleet. Crew complements totaled just over 40,000 personnel. If the casualty rates held true to historical patterns, they could expect to lose 28,000 people in the first 6 months. The silence in the office stretched out painfully. Kevin finally asked if anyone had found a legal way out of the treaty obligation. Ben shook his head slowly. Dr. Lisa Chen had spent the last 2 days going through every line of the document with a team of lawyers and linguists. The conscription clause was ironclad. Earth had signed away its military autonomy without realizing it. The Council could deploy human forces anywhere they wanted for any reason they deemed necessary. Lieutenant Amy Foster knocked on the doorframe and entered without waiting for permission. She was carrying her own tablet, and her expression suggested she had found something important. Amy had been digging through every piece of intelligence Earth had collected about the Queller sector conflict. What she discovered was disturbing in ways that went beyond simple military strategy. Amy explained that the war in the Queller sector had been going on for 73 years, not 50. The Council had been sending peacekeeping forces to that region for 7 decades, with almost no variation in tactics or strategy. They used the same formations and the same engagement protocols and the same weapons systems year after year, and every single species that joined the Council got sent to Queller within their first year of membership. Kevin felt something cold settle in his chest. He asked Amy to repeat that last part. She pulled up historical records showing the deployment patterns. Every new Council member for the past 70 years had been immediately sent to the worst combat zones. The founding species of the Council kept their own forces in safe territories handling patrol duties and ceremonial functions. The new members got sent to die. It was not just military conscription, it was a systematic culling. The Council used their wars to reduce the military strength of any species that might challenge their authority. Fresh members arrived with intact fleets and modern technology. They got ground down in endless combat until they were too weak to pose any threat to the established order. Ben swore quietly and asked if anyone on Earth had figured this out before signing the treaty. Kevin admitted that they had not. Everyone had been so eager to join the galactic community that they had not looked closely enough at the pattern. Humanity had been so focused on proving themselves worthy that they walked right into a trap that had been used on dozens of species before them. Jake. Morrison received the full intelligence briefing while the horizon was still 3 days from Earth. He read through Amy's analysis twice and then called a meeting with his senior staff. The briefing room was crowded with officers from every department. Engineering and tactical and medical and communications. Everyone needed to understand what they were facing. Jake laid out the situation without sugarcoating anything. The Council had tricked Earth into signing a military conscription treaty. They were being sent to a war zone where the historical casualty rate was 70%. The Council had been using this same strategy for 70 years to keep new member species weak and dependent. Humanity was just the latest victim in a long line of civilizations that had been sacrificed. The room erupted in angry voices. People demanded to know why they should comply with such an obvious trap. Others suggested they should refuse the order and fight the council if necessary. A few voices called for immediate withdrawal from the treaty regardless of the consequences. Jake let them vent for several minutes before calling for silence. He understood their anger because he felt it too. But rage alone would not save them. They needed to think strategically. Earth was one planet with 300 ships. The council represented thousands of worlds with millions of vessels. A direct confrontation would be suicide. Refusing the deployment order would result in economic blockade and possible military action. Humanity would be trapped in their own solar system and cut off from the galaxy. Emma Hayes spoke up from her position near the tactical display. She asked the question that everyone was thinking. If they could not refuse the order and they could not fight the council directly, then what options did they have? Were they really just going to sail into that meat grinder and die like obedient cattle? Jake smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. He told them they were absolutely going to comply with the council's order. They would deploy to the Queller sector exactly as commanded. But they were not going there to be cannon fodder. They were going there to demonstrate something the council had apparently forgotten. Humanity did not know how to quit. The chief engineer, Carl Davis, asked what Jake had in mind. Jake pulled up technical specifications for the Earth fleet vessels and began highlighting specific systems. He explained that the council had made a critical assumption about human technology. They assumed Earth's ships were primitive compared to galactic standards. They expected humanity to use standard council tactics and weapons because that was all any species ever did. But humanity had spent 200 years developing technology in isolation. They had not copied alien designs. They had built their own systems based on their own scientific principles. Earth's weapons and defensive systems were completely different from anything the Council used, and the Council had never bothered to ask for detailed technical specifications before issuing the deployment order. Emma began to understand, and her expression shifted from anger to something more dangerous. She asked if Jake was suggesting they go into combat using tactics and weapons the enemy would not expect. Jake nodded and said that was exactly what he was suggesting. The Council wanted cannon fodder, but they were going to get something very different. Over the next 60 hours, Earth Fleet headquarters became a storm of activity. Engineers worked around the clock modifying weapon systems and updating tactical software. Every ship in the deployment fleet received hardware upgrades that pushed their capabilities beyond original design specifications. Captains and tactical officers attended rapid briefings on new combat doctrines that had been developed specifically for this mission. Carl Davis barely slept during those 3 days. His engineering teams installed new railgun systems that could accelerate projectiles to 40% of light speed. They upgraded the missile networks with distributed artificial intelligence that allowed thousands of small warheads to operate as a coordinated swarm. They modified the navigation systems to enable combat maneuvers that would be impossible for standard council. Vessels Dr. Lisa Chen worked with the Tactical Planning Committee to analyze every scrap of intelligence about the enemy forces in the Queller sector. The primary hostile power was called the Kreller Empire. They had been fighting the Council for decades using overwhelming numbers and brute force tactics. The Kreller relied on heavy armor and powerful energy shields. Their ships were massive and slow, but incredibly tough. Lisa identified a critical weakness in the Kreller defensive strategy. Their shields were designed to deflect energy weapons, which was what the Council exclusively used. But the shields were much less effective against kinetic projectiles. And they had almost no defense against weapons that moved faster than their targeting systems could track. Admiral Parker reviewed the modified tactical plans and felt something he had not expected: hope. The plan was risky and untested, but it had a chance of working. More importantly, it gave humanity a way to turn this TA wrap into an opportunity. If they could win decisively in the Queller sector, it would force the Council to reevaluate their assumptions about human capabilities. The final hours before deployment were filled with quiet preparation. Crew members said goodbye to families through video links. Chaplains held services for those who wanted them. Medical teams ran final checks on equipment and supplies. Everyone knew they were sailing into danger, but the mood had shifted from despair to grim determination. Jake stood on the bridge of the horizon as the countdown reached 0. Around him, 300 ships powered up their drives in perfect synchronization. The deployment fleet formed up in standard formation and began accelerating toward the jump point that would take them to the Queller sector. From Earth, the fleet looked like a constellation of new stars rising into the night sky. Emma checked her tactical systems one final time and reported ready status. Every ship in the fleet confirmed their readiness. The weapons were armed and the new systems were online. Humanity was going to war not as victims, but as something the galaxy had never encountered before. Jake gave the order and the fleet jumped. 3 months of travel time lay ahead of them. 3 months to prepare and train and refine their strategy, and at the end of that journey they would show the Galactic Council that tricking humanity had been the worst mistake anyone could make. The human fleet emerged from their final jump into the Queller sector exactly 3 months after leaving Earth. Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the horizon watching the tactical displays light up with contact markers. The sector was even more chaotic than the intelligence reports had suggested. Debris fields from destroyed ships floated everywhere, creating navigation hazards that stretched for millions of kilometers. The remnants of decades of warfare littered the entire region. Emma Hayes worked her tactical station with practiced efficiency as the sensors cataloged the battlefield. She counted over 2,000 active Krellor warships in the immediate area. Their formation was spread across multiple grid sections, but they were beginning to converge on the human fleet's position. The Krellor had detected the new arrivals and were moving to intercept. The Council liaison officer assigned to the human fleet transmitted orders from his observation ship, positioned safely behind the lines. His name was Vexthor, and he was a mid-level functionary from the Rinthan species. His voice carried the bored tone of someone who had seen dozens of new species arrive in this sector, only to be ground down and destroyed. He ordered the human fleet to take up defensive positions along grid section 47 and await further instructions. Jake ignored the transmission completely. He had already decided that humanity would not be following Council tactical doctrine. Instead, he gave the order for the fleet to disperse using a pattern that no galactic species had ever employed in combat. The 300 human ships broke formation and scattered across a massive volume of space. They moved independently with no apparent coordination or strategy. Vexthor immediately began transmitting urgent demands for the humans to reform their lines. He cited 17 different tactical regulations that the fleet was violating. His messages became increasingly shrill as he realized the humans were not responding to his authority. Finally, he threatened to report their insubordination to the Council High Command. Jake still did not bother responding. The Krellor commander observed the human dispersal pattern from his flagship. His name was roughly translated as War Master Krellnoth, and he had been fighting in this sector for 23 years. He had seen countless Council fleets arrive with their rigid formations and predictable tactics. The humans appeared to be even more disorganized than usual. He ordered his armada to advance and destroy this latest offering of cannon fodder. The Krellor ships moved forward in their standard wall formation. Each vessel was enormous compared to human designs. Their hulls were covered in thick armor plating, and their shields glowed with the distinctive blue energy signature that had protected them through decades of combat. Krellnoth had lost count of how many Council ships he had destroyed using these same tactics. This battle would be no different. The first Krellor transmission arrived demanding honorable combat at traditional engagement range. It was a standard challenge that the Council forces always accepted. The ritual of warfare was deeply embedded in galactic culture. Ships faced each other at agreed distances and exchanged fire until one side retreated or was destroyed. It had been done this way for thousands of years across hundreds of conflicts. Jake's response was a single word transmitted in clear galactic standard language. He said no. Then he gave Emma permission to fire at will. The UES Horizon opened fire first. The railgun system that Carl Davis had installed released a tungsten projectile accelerated to 40% of light speed. The slug crossed the distance to the Krellor flagship faster than their sensors could register the launch. It punched through their energy shields without slowing down. The shields were designed to deflect energy beams, not solid matter moving at relativistic velocity. The projectile struck the flagship's hull with the force of a small nuclear weapon. The kinetic energy alone was enough to cause a catastrophic cascade failure through multiple decks. Armor plating that had withstood decades of plasma fire simply shattered. Internal compartments decompressed. Power systems overloaded. Secondary explosions rippled through the massive vessel. Krelnoth barely had time to process what had happened before every human ship in the sector opened fire simultaneously. 300 railguns launched their payloads at targets spread across the Krellor formation. The projectiles moved too fast to track and hit too hard to stop. Krellor ships that had survived countless battles died in seconds. Commander Sophie Blake coordinated the fighter wings from the UES Defiant. Her squadrons launched in perfect synchronization and moved to engage the Krellor point defense systems. Unlike the single pilot craft used by galactic species, human fighters operated in linked groups of 6. Their artificial intelligence systems shared targeting data in real time, creating a networked swarm that could overwhelm enemy defenses. Sophie gave the order to deploy the swarm package. Thousands of small missiles erupted from the fighter wings. Each missile was no bigger than a football, but they moved with frightening speed and coordination. The Krellor point defense batteries tried to engage, but there were simply too many targets. The tracking systems could not lock onto missiles that moved in such unpredictable patterns. The missiles struck their targets with precision. They did not carry explosive warheads because they did not need them. At the velocities they achieved, simple kinetic impact was enough. They punched through armor plating and shield generators and weapon emplacements. Each hit caused critical damage to systems that the Krellor relied on for survival. Lieutenant Amy Foster tracked the battle progression from her station aboard the Horizon. The tactical display showed the Krellor formation beginning to fragment as their command and control systems failed. Ships that had operated in perfect coordination for decades were suddenly isolated and confused. They tried to close distance with the human vessels to get into their optimal weapons range. Jake had anticipated this response. He gave the order for the fleet to maintain distance and continue the bombardment. Human ships accelerated away from the Krellor advance while their railguns kept firing. The Earth vessels were faster and more maneuverable than anything the Krellor had encountered. They could dictate the terms of engagement, and there was nothing the enemy could do about it. Captain Helen Cruz commanded the UES Vengeance, and she had been waiting for the perfect moment to deploy her ship's special payload. Her engineering team had built something they called the gravity hammer. It was a dense sphere of compressed matter wrapped in a portable gravity generator. When released with precise velocity and trajectory, it created an artificial singularity that lasted for exactly 4 seconds before collapsing. Helen identified a cluster of Krellor battleships trying to reform their defensive line. She calculated the trajectory and gave the order to launch. The gravity hammer deployed from the Vengeance's forward bay and accelerated toward the target zone. When it reached the optimal position, the gravity generator activated. The effect was devastating. The artificial singularity pulled everything within a 2-kilometer radius toward its center. Krellor ships weighing millions of tons were yanked out of position. Their shields collapsed under the gravitational stress. Hulls buckled and twisted as forces beyond their design specifications tore them apart. When the singularity collapsed 4 seconds later, it left behind nothing but debris and radiation. The Krellor armada was in complete disarray. Krelnoth tried desperately to reorganize his forces, but the humans gave him no opportunity. They moved through the battlefield like predators hunting prey. Every ship that tried to stand and fight was destroyed. Every formation that tried to hold position was broken apart by weapons moving too fast to avoid. Bexthor watched the battle unfold from his observation ship and felt something close to terror. This was not how warfare was conducted in civilized space. The humans were not following any recognized tactical doctrine. They used weapons that should not exist and tactics that violated every principle of honorable combat. And they were winning in a way that seemed almost effortless. The Council observer transmitted an emergency message to headquarters describing what he was witnessing. His report was filled with technical details about human weapons capabilities and tactical innovations. He emphasized that the humans were not simply defeating the Krellor. They were annihilating them using methods that made the enemy look primitive by comparison. 6 hours into the battle, the Krellor armada broke completely. The surviving ships began a desperate retreat toward the edge of the sector. Krelnoth transmitted a general withdrawal order, knowing that his career was over. In 23 years of combat, he had never suffered such a complete and humiliating defeat. The humans had destroyed over 1,500 of his ships while suffering no losses of their own. Jake ordered the fleet to cease fire and let the survivors escape. There was no point in pursuing a broken enemy. The objective had been to secure the Queller sector, and that mission was complete. He transmitted a status report to Admiral Parker back on Earth. Human casualties numbered 0 ships lost, with 14 vessels reporting minor damage. Total wounded personnel was 96, mostly from equipment malfunctions during the high-speed maneuvers. Emma reviewed the tactical data and felt a surge of pride mixed with grim satisfaction. Humanity had been sent here to die. The Council had expected them to be ground down slowly over months or years of attrition warfare. Instead, they had won a decisive victory in less than a single day. The rules of galactic warfare had just been rewritten. The Council liaison Vexthor sat in stunned silence aboard his observation ship. He had prepared a standard condolence message for when the human fleet was inevitably destroyed. Now he had no idea what to report. The humans had not just survived. They had demonstrated military capabilities that exceeded anything the Council possessed, and they had done it while completely ignoring every order he had given them. Jake composed a brief message to Council headquarters and transmitted it through official channels. The message was simple and direct. The Queller sector had been pacified. The Queller threat had been neutralized. The human fleet was awaiting new deployment orders. He did not apologize for ignoring the tactical directives. He did not explain his methods. He simply reported mission accomplished and waited to see how the Council would respond. Across the galaxy, the news of humanity's victory began to spread through official channels and unofficial networks. Species that had lost thousands of ships in the Queller sector over decades learned that the humans had won in 6 hours. The founding members of the Council received the reports with growing alarm. They had sent humanity to die, and instead humanity had proven themselves to be the most effective military force in known space. The emergency session of the Galactic Council, convened 8 hours after the Battle of Queller ended. The Grand Chamber on Council Station was filled with representatives from hundreds of species. Holographic feeds connected thousands more worlds across the galaxy. Everyone wanted to see how the founding members would respond to what the humans had done. Thexali stood at the central podium, looking far less confident than he had when welcoming humanity to the Council 3 months earlier. The Velcron diplomat held a data tablet containing the battle reports from Vexthor. His hands trembled slightly as he prepared to address the assembly. This was not supposed to happen. New species were supposed to arrive in the Queller sector and die slowly over months or years. They were supposed to be weakened and made dependent on Council support. The room fell silent as Thexali began to speak. He started by acknowledging that the human fleet had achieved an unexpected victory against the Krellor forces. Then his tone shifted to accusation. The humans had violated 17 separate tactical protocols. They had refused direct orders from the Council liaison officer. They had deployed weapon systems that had never been registered or approved for peacekeeping operations. They had engaged in combat methods that violated the traditional rules of honorable warfare. Matriarch Kessala, of the Azathi species, interrupted before Thexali could continue his list of complaints. Her voice was sharp and cutting. She pointed out that the humans had accomplished in 6 hours what the Council had failed to do in 50 years. The Queller sector was now secure. The Krellor threat had been neutralized. Perhaps the Council should be discussing why their own tactics had been so ineffective for so long. The chamber erupted in arguments. Some species supported Thexali's position that the humans needed to be disciplined for their insubordination. Others agreed with Kessala that results mattered more than protocol. A few representatives quietly wondered if humanity's victory exposed fundamental weaknesses in how the Council had been conducting military operations for centuries. Admiral Kevin Parker received clearance to travel to Council Station along with a delegation from Earth. The Council had not invited them, but they had not explicitly forbidden their presence either. Kevin brought Jake Morrison and Dr. Lisa Chen and General Nathan Price. They arrived at the station under heavy escort, as if the aliens expected them to start shooting. The escort was almost insulting in its excess. 40 armed guards for 4 humans. Kevin found it grimly amusing. If humanity wanted to cause violence on Council Station, a few dozen guards would not make any difference. But he understood the symbolism. The Council was trying to show that they were still in control even after everything that had happened in the Queller sector. They were kept waiting for 3 hours in a diplomatic holding area. The room was comfortable enough with seating designed for multiple body types and refreshments, suitable for various metabolisms. But the message was clear. The council would see them when the council was ready.
Kevin used the time to review the speech he had prepared with his staff. Lisa spent the waiting period studying the architecture and design of the station.
Everything about it spoke of age and tradition. The walls were covered in stone carvings depicting great moments in council history. The furniture was built in styles that had not changed in thousands of years. Even the lighting seemed deliberately dim and formal. This was a place where change came slowly if it came at all. Finally, they were escorted into the main council chamber. The room was enormous with a ceiling that stretched up several stories. Representatives from the founding species sat on raised platforms arranged in a circle around a central speaking area. Thousands of observers filled gallery seats that rose up the walls. Holographic displays showed millions more watching from across the galaxy. Kevin walked to the central podium with his delegation behind him. He looked up at the towering figures of the Velcron and Azathi and Rinthan and Corvex representatives. These were the species that had dominated galactic politics for millennia. They expected deference and submission from younger civilizations. Kevin had no intention of giving them either. The room fell completely silent as Kevin began to speak. His voice was calm, but it carried to every corner of the massive chamber. He started with a simple statement of fact. The Council had deliberately mistranslated their treaty to hide a military conscription clause. They had sent humanity to the Queller sector expecting them to die. It had been a calculated betrayal designed to weaken Earth's military strength. Thexali tried to interrupt, but Kevin raised his hand and continued speaking. The Council's tactics were outdated. Their technology had stagnated. Their entire approach to warfare was based on tradition and honor rather than effectiveness. They had been fighting the same wars for decades or even centuries because they were too rigid to adapt. Too proud to change. Too comfortable to innovate. The accusations hung in the air like physical weights. Species throughout the chamber shifted uncomfortably. Some looked angry. Others looked ashamed. A few looked thoughtful as if Kevin's words had struck something they had long suspected but never voiced. General Nathan Price stepped forward to stand beside Kevin. His presence added military authority to what might otherwise be dismissed as diplomatic posturing. Nathan had fought in 3 major conflicts during his career, and he knew warfare from the ground up. He told the assembled representatives that Earth's military analyst had studied 50 years of Council combat records from the Queller sector. The same mistakes had been repeated over and over. The same failed tactics had been used in battle after battle with predictable results. The Council had sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives rather than admit their methods were not working. New member species had been sent to die not because the wars required their presence, but because the founding members wanted to maintain their comfortable dominance. It was not military strategy. It was systematic culling dressed up as peacekeeping operations. Lisa Chen provided the linguistic analysis that proved the treaty had been deliberately mistranslated. She displayed side-by-side comparisons of the Velcron legal terminology and the English translation. The word rendered as voluntary actually meant mandatory. The phrase crisis event specifically referred to military conscription. Any competent translator would have caught these discrepancies, but the Council's official translation had conveniently glossed over them. The evidence was undeniable. Thexali tried to argue that translation between species was always imperfect and that misunderstandings were inevitable. But Lisa demolished that defense by showing that the same misleading translations had been used in treaties with 7 other species over the past century. It was not an accident. It was deliberate policy. Kevin let the implications sink in before delivering his next point. Humanity would remain in the Council, but the military conscription clause was now void. Earth would not serve as cannon fodder for wars the Council was too ineffective to win on their own. Instead, humanity was offering something different. They would train Council forces. They would share tactical innovations. They would help modernize the approach to warfare that had failed so many times. Thexali's response was immediate and furious. He declared the human demands unacceptable. Earth was bound by treaty and would obey Council directives or face the consequences. His voice rose as he listed the sanctions and blockades that would be imposed if humanity refused to comply. The threat was clear: submit or be destroyed. Nathan Price smiled, and it was not a friendly expression. He told Thexali that if the Council tried to enforce the old treaty terms, then humanity would simply withdraw from the Council entirely. Earth would return to isolation, and the Council would lose access to the only military force that had actually proven competent in recent memory. The threat was not empty, and everyone in the chamber knew it. The Battle of Queller had been broadcast across the galaxy. Every species had seen what human weapons could do. Every military analyst had studied the tactical recordings. Earth's technology was not centuries behind galactic standards as everyone had assumed. In many ways, it was far ahead. Jake Morrison added his voice to the discussion. He pointed out that the Krellor were not the Council's only enemy. Threats existed across the galaxy in multiple sectors. The old methods had failed against all of them. If the Council continued using outdated tactics, they would continue losing ships and personnel. But if they adapted and modernized, then perhaps some of those long-running conflicts could finally be resolved. The pragmatic argument carried weight with many in the chamber. Several representatives from non-founding species began to speak in support of the human proposal. They had lost ships and people in various Council peacekeeping operations. They had watched their forces be wasted in battles that seemed designed to fail. The idea of actually winning these conflicts instead of merely surviving them was appealing. Matriarch Kesiala spoke again, and her tone had shifted. She acknowledged that the Council had become complacent. Traditions that once served them well had become obstacles to progress. Perhaps it was time to consider new approaches. She proposed a compromise. Humanity would receive greater autonomy in military matters in exchange for helping to train and modernize Council forces. The debate continued for 2 full days. Representatives argued about precedent and tradition, and the proper balance of power within the Council structure. Some species supported the changes because they saw the practical benefits. Others opposed them because they feared what it meant for the established order. The founding members were divided, with the Azathi pushing for reform, while the Velkron resisted any change. In the end, the Council had no real choice. The evidence of their military failures was overwhelming. The success of human tactics was undeniable, and the threat of Earth withdrawing from the Council entirely was too costly to ignore. They needed humanity more than humanity needed them. The new treaty was drafted over a period of intense negotiation. Earth gained 3 permanent seats on the Council, giving them actual voting power and decision-making. The mandatory military conscription clause was removed and replaced with voluntary cooperation agreements. Admiral Kevin Parker was appointed Supreme Commander of the Reformed Defense Fleet, with authority to reorganize tactical doctrines across all Council forces. The signing ceremony was held on Earth in Geneva. This time there were no celebrations in the streets. People understood that humanity had won something important, but the cost could have been catastrophic. Thousands of lives had been risked on the gamble that human technology and tactics would prove superior. The victory felt less like triumph and more like a narrow escape from a trap. Jake stood on the bridge of the horizon, watching the ceremony through the holographic display. The ship was still in the Queller sector, serving as flagship for the occupation forces. Around him, the crew worked quietly at their stations. They had proven something important to the galaxy, but they knew the real work was just beginning. 2 years had passed since the incident at the Omega Nebula, and Kyle Morrison stood in the Coalition Assembly Hall, watching the proceedings with a sense of quiet satisfaction. The hall had been expanded 3 times to accommodate the growing membership, and now it could hold representatives from 37 different species. Another dozen species maintained observer status and were actively considering full membership. Dr. Paul Martinez, who now served as Coalition Chief Science Officer, stood beside Kyle, watching the vote taking place on the main display. "We have changed the balance of power in this galaxy. The Council still has more members, but barely. We control more resources and more advanced technology, and more strategic territory than they do." A young intern from Earth approached them with a data pad and asked a question that had been on many minds lately. "Sir, are we going to war with the Council?" Kyle smiled gently and shook his head. "No. Something interesting has happened. The Council is changing." He pulled up a holographic news feed that showed Counselor Vexathera making an announcement from Concordia Station. Her crystalline form seemed less rigid than it had been 2 years ago, and her voice carried a different tone. "The Galactic Council is implementing comprehensive reforms," Vexathera announced to the assembled Council members. Membership criteria are being revised to allow for greater diversity in governmental structures. Military expenditure limits are being relaxed to acknowledge the right of self-defense. There will be greater tolerance for cultural and governmental diversity among member species. We recognize that our previous standards were too restrictive and may have excluded worthy civilizations. They are copying us, the intern observed with surprise. Paul shook his head. They are adapting. Competition forced them to evolve just as it forced us to become more organized and more unified and more strategic. We made each other better. Lisa Monroe, who now commanded all coalition defense forces, watched from the observation deck as ships from dozens of worlds conducted joint military exercises in nearby space. Commander Jakara stood beside her wearing a coalition military uniform, instead of his traditional Theric clan leader robes. His bronze scales gleamed under the station lights. My people have a saying, Jakara said quietly. The tree that stands alone breaks in the storm. The forest bends and survives. We are not alone anymore, Lisa agreed. We built something that none of us could have built separately. A priority transmission alert interrupted their conversation. Admiral, we are receiving a communication from the Galactic Council. They are requesting formal diplomatic talks regarding mutual cooperation protocols. Lisa and Jakara exchanged surprised glances. Not membership negotiations, Lisa asked carefully. No, Admiral. Cooperation as equals. They want to discuss having two separate organizations working together on common concerns like piracy suppression and natural disaster response, and first contact protocols with newly discovered species. Lisa felt a smile spreading across her face. Patch it through to Ambassador Morrison immediately. I think he will want to handle this one personally. In the diplomatic wing, Kyle received the transmission with careful optimism. The hologram showed not Vexithera, but a different counselor named Shenva, who had always been one of the more moderate voices in the council chambers. Ambassador Morrison, I am Counselor Shenva. The council wishes to propose a framework for cooperation between our two organizations. Kyle kept his expression neutral and professional. I am listening, Counselor. We recognize that the coalition represents legitimate interests of species that do not fit traditional council membership criteria, Shenva said. We also recognize that some of our policies were unnecessarily restrictive and excluded worthy civilizations for arbitrary reasons. We propose a mutual recognition agreement, two separate but equal organizations that cooperate on shared concerns while maintaining independent sovereignty. The Council would formally recognize the coalition as equals, Kyle said carefully. Not as rebels or rogue states, but as a legitimate alternative. Yes, Shenva replied. No more sanctions. No more proxy conflicts, no more attempts to undermine your organization. Instead, we propose joint task forces for mutual concerns like combating piracy, technology exchange programs for scientific advancement, formal borders that both organizations respect, and regular diplomatic contact to prevent misunderstandings. This is a significant shift in the Council's position, Kyle observed. Shenva's facial tendrils rippled in what Kyle had learned was their species' equivalent of a rueful smile. Competition is a powerful teacher, Ambassador. You forced us to examine our assumptions and our prejudices. Some of them were deeply flawed. We saw diversity as weakness when it is actually strength. We saw rapid change as dangerous when it is actually innovation. We saw military preparedness as aggression when it is actually prudence. Over the next 6 months, the Coalition and Council negotiated what became known as the Treaty of Two Stars. It established formal diplomatic relations between the two organizations. It created joint committees for shared concerns like scientific research and emergency response. It defined territorial boundaries that both sides agreed to respect. Most importantly, it ensured that neither organization could claim authority over the other. The signing ceremony took place simultaneously on Concordia Station and Coalition Station Alpha, with holographic links connecting the two locations. Kyle found himself standing next to Counselor Vexithera in a moment he had never imagined possible. You were right, Vexithera said quietly. That day in the council chamber when you said we did not have authority over sovereign species who choose a different path, we let our pride and our fear make us rigid. We almost made ourselves irrelevant. You adapted, Kyle replied. That takes courage too. Earth taught us something important, Vexithera continued. When we rejected you, humanity did not spend 50 years trying to become what we wanted. You built something new, Something that worked for who you actually are, and you made it work so well that we had no choice but to pay attention. And in paying attention you grew, Kyle said. Both our organizations are stronger now than either would have been alone. President Helen Grant attended the ceremony in person and stood at the podium to deliver the keynote address. She looked out at the assembled representatives from both the Council and the Coalition and spoke with quiet conviction. 3 years ago, the Galactic Council told us we were not ready to join the galactic community. They were correct, but not for the reasons they thought. We were not ready to join someone else's structure. We needed to build our own. And in doing so, we proved that this galaxy is large enough for multiple visions of cooperation and peace. She paused and looked directly at the Council delegation. You banned Earth from the Galactic Council, so we built our own, and now we stand here as equals. Both organizations are better for having competition. Both organizations are stronger for having a counterbalance. Competition breeds excellence. Diversity breeds innovation. This treaty represents not the victory of one side over another, but the recognition that there are many paths to the same goal. The ceremony concluded with representatives from both organizations mingling freely. Kyle noticed Jakara deep in conversation with a Council military commander, comparing tactical doctrines. Lisa Monroe was explaining Coalition shipbuilding techniques to curious Council engineers. The Lumini representatives were demonstrating their unique form of art to fascinated Council cultural officers. Sophie Blake approached Kyle with updated statistics. Galactic trade volumes are up 40% since the treaty announcement. Scientific collaboration proposals are flooding both organizations. 12 species that were not aligned with either side have now applied for observer status in both organizations. Kyle smiled at the data. When everyone does better, everyone benefits. From Earth, Paul Martinez sent his final report analyzing the treaty's long-term implications. The Coalition forced the Council to evolve. The Council forced the Coalition to organize and professionalize. Both organizations are now more dynamic and more inclusive and more effective than either would have been alone. Humanity's legacy will not be conquest or domination. It will be that we refused to accept arbitrary limitations and we showed others how to do the same. 5 years after being rejected from the Galactic Council, Kyle stood on the observation deck of Coalition Station Alpha, which had been expanded to 3 times its original size. Ships from both Coalition and Council worlds moved freely through, space trading and exploring and cooperating on joint missions. Jakara joined him as had become their custom on the anniversary of the Coalition's founding. Do you think they regret it, rejecting Earth that day? Kyle considered the question carefully. Maybe. But if they had not rejected us, none of this would exist. The Coalition would not exist. The reforms would not have happened. The galaxy would still be operating under a single rigid system that excluded too many worthy species. Humanity has a talent for turning obstacles into opportunities, Jakara observed. We are stubborn that way, Kyle agreed. With a slight smile, they watched in comfortable silence as a newly commissioned exploration vessel departed for uncharted space. The ship's crew included members from both Coalition and Council species working together. The future was uncertain as it always had been, but it was also full of possibilities that had not existed 5 years ago. They had been banned from the galactic community. So they built their own, and in doing so they changed the galaxy forever, not through conquest or force, but through persistence and innovation, and an absolute refusal to accept that there was only one way to reach for the stars. The galaxy was big enough for different paths and different dreams and different ways of living together. That was the lesson Earth had taught, and it was a lesson that would echo through the centuries to come.